Hey, it's time for another episode of the Confederate Hat Hour, where I wear a Confederate hat, talk about Confederate stuff, and some of the Confederate stuff, it ain't true. Now, people sometimes say that the Confederacy wasn't so much about slavery as it was about Christianity. They even put religion right in the preamble of their Constitution. They thought this was an advantage over the old United States. They said, "We, the people of the Confederate States," etc., "invoking the favor and guidance of Almighty God, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the Confederate States of America." Well, they might have invoked that favor and guidance, but obviously God wasn't having it. And here's what The Book Tree, a Christian reference for children's literature, says Robert E. Lee said at the end of the war. "We have appealed to the God of battles, and he has decided against us." Now, this quotation is famous, and it's also both sort of noble and charming in its way, but what's peculiar is that a Christian children's book is extolling Lee. You'd have thought they'd have gotten the message back in 1865. One writer, by the way, Richard Rollins, has suggested that Lee's own religious faith is what led him to some of his most erratic decisions. Rollins says that Lee was so confident that God would work things out for the best that he didn't consider that he needed to plan for the worst. And this is supposed to account for such colossal tactical mistakes as Pickett's charge. Rollins seems to think that he's praising Lee with this point. Rollins writes, "We've already seen in his private life death held no fear for Lee. The logic that led him to conclude that those he loved were in a better place after death also shaped his command of the Army of Northern Virginia. The same belief in an omnipotent and loving God allowed many of his men to go into combat unafraid or with little fear of being wounded or killed. God directed events, and if one's time to die had come, nothing could stop the bullet. If it was not yet time, one would live through the battle. The result was that the Confederate soldier could go into battle feeling free to be as aggressive as he wanted." Rollins has an entry from a diary or a letter from one of Lee's soldiers. This guy wrote, "In the Battle of Seven Pines, in which we lost 1/3 of our regiment in about 20 minutes amidst the most terrific shower of shot and shell of this whole war, the Lord not only so far sustained me as to enable me to stand up and do my duty for my country, but to do it without the least fear of anything man can do unto me. Nor did I, as many men seem to do, lose sight of my personal danger. My mood was so calm that my calculations were perfectly rational. I felt that the Lord's hand was with me, that his shield was over me, and that whatever befell me would be by his agency or permission, and therefore it would all be well with me. It was a period of positive religious enjoyment, and yet of the most vigorous discharge of my duties as a soldier. Now, fearlessness is not courage, it's foolishness or it's fanaticism. Now, I don't know exactly what this soldier was really thinking, but if it was really that he didn't need to control himself because God would make it all come out for the best no matter what he did, then he was deranged, he was not courageous." In April 1863, just a couple months before Gettysburg and Vicksburg, 98 Southern ministers of diverse Protestant faiths wrote an address to Christians throughout the world on behalf of the Confederacy. And they said that they weren't going to talk about politics. They said, "If we were moved to make this address by any inclination to meddle with political questions, we should deserve to have it despised by you. But obviously it's about nothing but politics. Here's some political claims and political remarks." I don't know whether they knew that they were being disingenuous. But then they start talking about the specific political issue over which the war was fought. The Emancipation Proclamation is one of the indefensible acts by the Union. Christianity, far from not being involved in political questions, condemns efforts to improve affairs. What shall sound Christianity say to that one-idea philanthropy which, in the name of an imaginary good, in blind fury rushes upon 1,000 unquestionable evils? I wonder what they would have said about the American revolutionaries, who, in the name of the imaginary good of a government that acknowledges that it derives its just powers from the consent of the governed, in blind fury rushed upon 1,000 unquestionable evils. But there was one piece of politics that their religion was very clear about, that abolitionism was an affront against God. And there has not been an awful lot of progress on this since 1863. In 1994, when the neo-Confederate movement was just getting started, in response to some upset about the Confederate flag, 15 Southern ministers in Southern Partisan magazine explicitly appealed back to the 1863 document in The Moral Case for the Confederate Flag. The article is mostly the usual lies, distortions, and invasions from neo-Confederates. It's reasonably civil compared to what I'm going to show you in a minute, but they appeal to one James Thornwell, pro-slavery theologian, who happens to be the gentleman that this video will mostly be about. So when I read an 1850 sermon of his in a few minutes, please bear in mind that contemporary neo-Confederates currently hold his views unreconstructed. They follow their forebears in denying that their religious writing is political, but then they identify their religion with a political entity, very explicitly. Now, here is a contemporary Christian magazine published by the Calcedon Presbyterian Church, which has no covers at all that look like they were photographed by Aryan pederasty fetishists. In 1997, the magazine interviewed one J. Stephen Wilkins, a Presbyterian minister and former board member of the League of the South, about whom more below, about the Civil War. If someone were to write fiction about some unreconstructed Alabama preacher literally repeating pro-slavery sermons from the 1850s, the fiction would be rejected as politically correct hysterics. Well, but here he is. Well, he doesn't like ungodly racism, and that seems okay so far, but then you wonder, why the qualifier? Are you okay with godly racism? And it turns out that the answer is kinda yes. Slavery, he says, if it operates biblically, is perfectly legitimate. To indict slavery in principle as evil is to charge God with evil. And so the problem about slavery was that the abolitionists were against slavery as a whole, and that is the same as being against God as a whole. So he says that if the abolitionists just been very modest in their goals, there wouldn't have been a fight. It's almost as though this guy thinks that the Civil War was fought over slavery, but it's definitely as though he thinks that slavery was a divinely ordained institution. And here he is, misspelling bastion, and saying that the Confederacy, the South, was the last bastion of Christendom, that he wants the whole country to return to some Confederate Southern and godliness. He really is doubling down on the idea that the Confederacy and Christianity are very closely related, sort of functionally the same. The Sons of Confederate Veterans have some summer camps. Here's some promotional material from one, the Sam Davis Youth Camp, which is here in Central Texas. They say, the boys and girls are taught by knowledgeable counselors who teach on the causes of the war between the states, the tactics of generals in the war, and debunking myths taught in the mainstream media. Research and facts teach students how to make up their own minds as to their heritage. Campers learn the value of analytical thought, how to articulate their beliefs, and encouraged to show Christian love and charity to all. And if you're skeptical about that's what they're doing, one camper explains, nothing can explain the week we spent at Sam Davis Youth Camp. Love is overabundant here. Love for our Confederacy friends and our God. Until next year, God save the South. C.R. Camper. This just in. Child attends brainwashing camp. Later endorses brainwashing. By the way, I haven't blurred out those faces because they're on public promotional material, but if you feel the need to go harass these children, quit your meanness. But, this camp is apparently very explicit that the Confederacy and Christianity are very closely related to one another, and God save the South. All right, remember the League of the South guy? Here are some of these very fine people. This is at Charlottesville. They've claimed up to 25,000 members at various times, and they say, the League of the South is a Southern nationalist organization headquartered in Killeen, Alabama, whose ultimate goal is a, quote, free and independent Southern Republic. The League defines the Southern United States as the states that make up the Confederate States of America. While political independence ranks highly among our goals, we are also a religious and social movement advocating a return to a more traditional, conservative, Christian-oriented Southern culture. And you might be thinking, crazed Charlottesville rioters don't really make much of a difference intellectually. They are managing to get people killed, but setting that aside, let's remember this guy, Roy Moore, who was one child molestation away from being elected to the Senate by the good people of the great state of Alabama, and is running again for that office in 2020. Mr. Moore's Foundation for Moral Law has enjoyed holding conferences with one Mr. Chuck Baldwin, who has explained, I believe the U.S. Constitution, as originally written, was the greatest civil document ever devised by man. I steadfastly support the principles contained in the Declaration of Independence. I believe America's founding fathers to be the greatest generation of Christian philosophers and patriots to ever live. I believe the South was right in the war between the states, and I am not a racist. And I invite anyone to ask any of the numerous members of minority races that attend my church to verify that. Neither do I believe that the leaders of the old Confederacy were racists. In fact, I hold men such as General Robert E. Lee and General T.J. Stonewall Jackson in highest regard. I'm glad that's settled. Now, Moore has been given over $500,000 by League of the South member Michael Perutka, so we are literally one child molestation away from the League of the South having a seat in the United States Senate. Their membership is probably very small, but their views are widespread enough to represent political orthodoxy in at least one state, and those views literally include directly believing pro-slavery sermons from the 1850s. So, we have the Confederate Constitution, Confederate clerics, retired Colonel Lee, children's book authors, contemporary theologians, summer camp organizers, terrorist organizers, and child molesting would-be U.S. senators all on the same side, insisting that the Confederacy was distinctly godly, though at least Lee seemed to agree that God was not in the end a Confederate. This is a pipeline from intellectually abused children to politically and even sexually abusive adults. So, this is the first of a few videos about Confederate Christianity, and the idea is just to read in some sermons from before and during the Civil War to drive home what Confederate Christianity was. Now, you might expect me to sort of take a scoffing, what I think of as an entomological approach. Entomology is the study of insects. And a lot of people who do sort of pop intellectual history, which is what this is, of people that they don't care for, they don't act like they're reading words written by people. They act like they're looking at distasteful specimens of some species of critter. And what I've been doing in this video so far has been kind of entomological, but now I'm going to look at these sermonizers as people instead of as specimens of Homo Confederati. So here's a basic guide to what we're going to find. Confederate Christianity emphasizes two ideas that undermine the very idea of morality. First, let's think about what's called the Protestant work ethic. Early Protestant and especially Puritan writers thought something about Catholicism, and I don't know whether this is true. I'm not an historian of Catholicism, but anyway, they thought that Catholicism set up a hierarchy within which some tasks were more godly or divine than others. So Catholic priests in particular were supposed to be higher up in this hierarchy than most of the rest of us. Now, Catholic priests can be divided into regular and secular. A secular priest is one who works in the seculum, the world. A regular priest was one who works according to rules. So regular in the sense of regulated by rules, like the rule of St. Benedict for Benedictine monks or the rule of St. Francis for Franciscan monks. These were monks in monasteries, and for one reason or another, Protestants did not care for these guys. Like, secular priests were public ministers of the gospel, but regular priests were just parasites living on alms. So partly as a response to that, and partly for plenty of other reasons, they introduced what we call the Protestant work ethic, to claim that any work can be equally divinely inspired, and that everyone, not just monks, can relate to God directly through their work. Everyone has a calling or vocation. The voca in vocation is the same voca as in vocal, as in to vocalize, as in to call. And so far this sounds good. But when you say that monks don't have any special dignity, you could also say that slaves don't suffer any special indignity. I mean, if God has sent all of us into the world to pursue our several distinct purposes, then God can have sent slaves into the world specifically to obey and occupy the special servile rung of society. Now, none of the early Protestant writers that I've studied in this area think that anyone but you is outstandingly qualified to tell you what work God has called you to do. When I read the early Protestant work ethicists, I actually see common sense about career advice. Pay attention to what thoughtful people have to tell you, but at the end of the day, you're the only one who can pick up the phone when God is calling you. So you have to work at it to turn the idea of a calling into the idea of a calling to be enslaved. Still, for some reason, Confederate Christians decided that somehow white masters had better access to God's plan for those they held in bondage than those enslaved people had themselves. Second, let's think about the standard philosophical argument called the problem of evil. You have heard of this. In outline form, it's just the challenge: if God created the world and is so powerful and so good, then why is there so much awfulness? If God is God powerless to save a baby bird, then he's not omnipotent. Does he not mind the baby bird starving in the cold? Then he's not omnibenevolent. This is called a problem because most of the people who've dealt with it have felt it as a problem for their pre-existing faith. That is, they already believe in an all-powerful, all-good creator, and then they have a problem reconciling their faith with what they can see. If you don't already have the belief, then you won't experience this as a problem. So for non-religious people, problem of evil is a little bit of a weird name, but most of the people who've confronted it have been religious, and that's why it has that name. Theologians and philosophers of religion have offered several solutions to the problem. There are several already in the book of Job. They've come up with plenty more. One of those is the claim that nothing is actually bad. So on this view, we live in the best of all possible worlds, and if we ever think that something is bad, we're just wrong. You can't tell whether something is good or bad unless you can see it in its full context. We can't see anything in its full context. We can deduce from God's goodness that everything is good, but we could never start with a specific alleged horror and learn from it that there is anything bad in the world, because we don't have a God's eye perspective on things. Now, this is a radically anti-morality position to take. If everything is for the best in this best of all possible worlds, then whatever I do will be for the best in this best of all possible worlds. So if I sew a skin suit from the flesh of babies or enslave people, then it turns out that sewing skin suits from the flesh of babies or enslaving people will be for the best in this best of all possible worlds. There can be no moral restraint. Now, ordinarily, people who push this argument aren't trying to undermine morality, and they're not aware that they're doing so, but Confederate Christianity tells us that everything is part of God's plan, and hence not subject to criticism. Well, but if everything is good, then slavery is good, and if you can't see why it's good, well, that's your problem, and you should have the humility to acknowledge that you can't understand God's big plan. Now, setting aside other things, one of the obvious logical problems with this defense of slavery is that if everything that happens is for the best, then if slavery is abolished, then that will be for the best. If you say that everything is for the best, so slavery is for the best, then you've accidentally also said that abolition will be for the best if it happens. That's the problem with saying that everything is for the best and rejecting any idea of moral constraint or guidance. So this defense of slavery was not very well thought out. Partly, of course, because if you're trying to prove something false, you have to say something false somewhere. But here's how this works like in a conversation. There are certain philosophical convictions that people regularly invent on the fly to avoid finding out that they're wrong about something. For instance, while we usually use the word skeptical to mean a healthy criticism, there's also skepticism in the sense of a dogmatic refusal to believe anything, however well confirmed it is by evidence. People who don't want to believe something routinely invent skepticism of this kind. So there's this thing called gaslighting. It's named after a movie in which a husband is trying to convince his wife that she's insane, so she'll sign some property over to him or something. So he keeps fiddling with the gaslight in her room with a switch that nobody knows about, so she figures she must be crazy because she keeps thinking that the lights are going on and off and they can't possibly be. So gaslighting is trying to get someone to doubt his own sanity and his basic ability to think. People do this in the real world, especially in abusive relationships. I do want to point out that people sometimes on the internet will use gaslighting to mean disagreeing with them, which is an unfortunate abuse of language, but it is a perfectly legitimate concept. It's trying to get people to, for no good reason, question their basic ability to perceive the world and think about the world and know things. Skepticism, when you apply it to yourself, is a weird form of auto-gaslighting. Someone has laid out absolutely convincing evidence of something, and a rational person would come to a certain conclusion, but you don't like the conclusion, so instead of accepting it, you cast doubt on your own ability to learn from evidence. And what's peculiar about this is that even while you're saying that you can't trust yourself, you're still insisting on trusting your ability to doubt yourself, which itself is a form of self-trust, since a person who can't ever rethink something is a desperate failure as a thinker. Skepticism is a bottomless well of inauthenticity. But skepticism, when it's a rhetorical trick, is basically gaslighting the person you're talking to. Someone has laid out evidence for some claim, and you don't want him to accept it, so you try to get him to doubt his ability to reason. After all, if no one can know anything, you certainly can't know whatever it is that you thought that you had proved. Now, in this case, the Confederate Christian adopts a form of gaslighting skepticism when he asks how we could ever know that something was bad. Slavery might seem bad to you, but can you really be certain enough to actually do anything about it? How dogmatic and arrogant you All right, so let me turn to the text. So what I've got here is a sermon entitled The Rights and Duties of Masters, delivered by James H. Thornwell, whom I mentioned earlier as being a person that contemporary neo-Confederates remain fond of. It was delivered May 26, 1850. So it's 10 years before the secessions started. It was widely reprinted. I'm going to be reading it from a volume of sermons entitled God Ordained This War, edited by David Chesbrough in 1991. Professor Chesbrough, I hope that I did not just butcher your name. I'm just going to read the whole thing. Neo-Confederates delight in pretending that things are quoted out of context, whether they are or not. And they also sometimes delight in taking things out of context and quoting them and pretending that that's not what they're doing. So I'm just going to go ahead and give you the entire context, and then this will not be a problem. So he begins by stating his text, "Masters, give unto your servants that which is just and equal, knowing that ye also have a master in heaven." Colossians 4:1. God has not permitted such a remarkable phenomenon as the unanimity of the civilized world in its execration of slavery to take place without design. This great battle with the abolitionists has not been fought in vain. This is 1850, so the great battle isn't even the Civil War yet. This great battle with the abolitionists has not been fought in vain. The muster of such immense forces, the fury and bitterness of the conflict, the disparity in resources of the parties in the war, the conspicuousness, the unexampled conspicuousness of the event have all been ordered for wise and beneficent results. And when the smoke shall have rolled away, it will be seen that a real progress has been made in the practical solution of the problems which produced the collision. Truth must triumph. God will vindicate the appointments of his providence, and if our institutions are indeed consistent with righteousness and truth, we can calmly afford to bide our time. We can watch the storm which is beating furiously against us without terror or dismay. We can receive the assault of the civilized world, trusting in him who has all the elements at his command and can save as easily by one as 1,000. It is not the narrow question of abolition or of slavery, not simply whether we shall emancipate our Negroes or not. The real question is the relations of man to society, of states to the individual, and of the individual to states, a question as broad as the interests of the human race. Now, Thornwell has opened up by saying that all is for the best in this best of all possible worlds, but now he has identified individualism and liberty with slavery. So bear in mind that when Southern leaders claim to be defending liberty, they literally mean precisely the liberty to own slaves. I mean, that's what the guy says that his issue is about. And he is not talking about the Civil War. He is talking specifically about the struggle with abolitionists. Right? All right. So these are the mighty questions which are shaking thrones to their centers, upheaving the masses like an earthquake and rocking the solid pillars of this union. The parties in this conflict are not merely abolitionists and slaveholders. They are atheists, socialists, communists, red Republicans, Jacobins on the one side, and friends of order and regulated freedom on the other. In one word, the world is the battleground, Christianity and atheism the combatants, and the progress of humanity is at stake. Now, I personally have never seen anyone accusing anyone of being a communist prior to this, 1850, 2 years after the Communist Manifesto. Whenever anyone is accused of being a communist, please remember that this accusation has been lodged at virtually everyone for well over 150 years. So here Thornwell is claiming that abolitionism is communism. No one has ever made communism sound better than that. If communism is abolition, then proletarians of the world unite, for you have nothing to lose but your chains. One party seems to regard society, with all its complicated interests, its divisions and subdivisions, as the machinery of man, which, as it has been invented and arranged by his ingenuity and skill, may be taken to pieces, reconstructed, altered, or repaired as experience shall indicate defects or confusion in the original plan. So here, Thornwell explicitly rejects the entire idea of the United States of America. We had a whole revolution about this. Our side said that we have rights, and here's the quote, "To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." The other side claimed that the king had some special divine right to rule us, whether we consented or not. We had a whole revolution about this that has inspired the world for a quarter of a millennium, but this guy thinks that it was a bad idea. His response is that governments are expressions of traditions and customs that constitute a background to all of our actions. We cannot meaningfully criticize these customs and traditions because they are specifically the background or context against which or within which all of our actions make sense. To try to criticize them would be something like saying nobody should speak English, but saying it in English, or this is not a sentence, or something self-undercuttingly absurd like that. So we can't meaningfully criticize our own government, he's saying. Here, Thornwell has adopted a kind of political conservatism that is so extreme that it really qualifies as a form of moral relativism. Moral relativists don't believe that there is any such thing as morality. What they think exists are social customs and habits. They don't think that individuals really exactly exist. They think that an individual person is really just a bundle of social influences. They don't think that societies mold us, like someone trimming a tree that has a pre-existing basic kind of a tree plan to end up with a shape of tree that they want. They think that our societies constitute us from nothing, that you're not there except insofar as some customs are determining the motions of your flesh. So since you are nothing but a node in a social network, it would make no sense, it would be literally insane for you to try to criticize that network. Thus, the argument is, abolitionism is unintelligible. Slavery and its enforcement are part of our very ability to think and live. I mean, they're not part of other people's ability to think and live, but they're part of our ability to think and live. So we can't criticize it. If you exist in a society that has slavery, you cannot question it. So to reject the ability to think is irrational. To reject some important part of your society is to reject the ability to think, so it is irrational. That's the underlying argument, right? So it's a conservatism that has gone absolutely insane. All right. The other party, so this is his view that I've just kind of reviewed, the other party beholds in it the ordinance of God and contemplates this little scene of human life as placed in the middle of a scheme whose beginnings must be traced to the unfathomable depths of the past and whose development and completion must be sought in the still more unfathomable depths of the future. A scheme, as Butler expresses, he's an English theologian and ethicist in the 1700s, really smart guy. A scheme, as Butler expresses it, quote, not fixed but progressive, every way incomprehensible, in which consequently irregularity is the confession of our ignorance, disorder the proof of our blindness, and with which it is as awful temerity to tamper as to sport with the name of God. So this is the idea, again, that slavery is ordained by God and that you cannot question the codes of your society. The part, accordingly, which is assigned to us in the tumult of the age is the maintenance of the principles upon which the security of social order and the development of humanity depends in their application to the distinctive institutions which have provoked upon us the malediction of the world. The apostle briefly sums up all that is incumbent in the present crisis upon the slaveholders of the South in the words of the text, "Masters, give unto your servants that which is just and equal, knowing that ye also have a master in heaven." It would be an useless waste of time to spend many words in proving that the servants contemplated by the apostle were slaves. Finding it impossible to deny that slavery as an existing element of society is actually sanctioned by Christ and his apostles, those who would preserve some show of consistency in their veneration of the scriptures and their condemnation of us resolve the conduct of the founders of Christianity into motives of prudence and considerations of policy. While they admit that the letter of the scriptures is distinctly and unambiguously in our favor, they maintain that their spirit is against us, and that our Savior was content to leave the destruction of whatsoever was morally wrong in the social fabric to the slow progress of changes in individual opinions wrought by the silent influence of religion, rather than endanger the stability of governments by sudden and disastrous revelations. But it may be worthwhile to expose the confusion of ideas from which this distinction betwixt the letter and spirit of the gospel has arisen, and which has been a source of serious perplexity both to the defenders and to the enemies of slavery. If it can be shown that slavery contravenes the spirit of the gospel, that as a social relation it is essentially unfavorable to the cultivation and growth of the graces of the Spirit, that it is unfriendly to the development of piety and to communion with God, or that it retards the onward progress of man, that it hinders the march of society to its destined goal and contradicts that supremacy of justice which is the soul of the state and the lifeblood of freedom. If these propositions can be satisfactorily sustained, then it is self-condemned. Religion and philanthropy alike require us to labor for its destruction, and every good man amongst us would feel bound to contribute to its removal, and even the voice of patriotism would demand that we should wipe from our country the foul reproach of standing in the way of the destined improvement of the world. The confusion upon which this subject has arisen from a twofold misapprehension. In relation to the nature of the slavery tolerated in the letter of the Scriptures, and the other in relation to the spirit of Christianity itself. So the abolitionist, according to Thornwell, thinks that slavery is anti-Christian. Thornwell responds that it's perfectly compatible with the letter of the Bible, and the abolitionist is supposed to reply that it's incompatible with the spirit of the Bible. It is common to describe slavery as the property of man in man, as the destruction of all human and personal rights, the absorption of the humanity of one individual into the will and power of another. The very idea of a slave, says Dr. William Ellery Channing was an anti-slavery leader of the Unitarian Church in the early 19th century. He was a apparently very racist opponent of slavery. He thought that slavery should be ended, but that former owners should still manage their former slaves' lives, which is weird. He later developed to accept immediate abolitionism. So the very idea of a slave, says Dr. Channing, is that he belongs to another, that he's bound to live and labor for another, to be another's instrument, and to make another's will his habitual law, however adverse to his own. We have thus, says he in another place, established the reality and sacredness of human rights, and that slavery is an infraction of these is too plain to need any labored proof. Slavery violates not one but all, and violates them not incidentally but necessarily, systematically from its very nature. In other words, in every system of slavery, from the operation of its inherent and essential principles, the slave ceases to be a person, a man, and becomes a mere instrument or thing. Now, there's a trick there. Slavery tries to do that to somebody, but of course you logically can't do that. Right? That's sort of one of the issues, is that slavery is completely incompatible with the nature of human beings. So the argumentative trick that he's going to pull here is by saying, since you can't actually turn a person into a non-person, slavery doesn't, so what's the problem? And the abolitionist never said that slavery succeeded in turning people into non-people. The abolitionist says that slavery tries to turn people into non-people, and that it is immoral to try to turn a person into a non-person. Even if you fail at the thing that is evil that you're trying to do, you're still trying to do something evil, and you're evil, and your attempt itself is evil. All right, Dr. Channing does not charge this result upon the relation as it obtains under particular codes, or at particular times, or in particular places. He says distinctly and emphatically that it violates all human rights, not incidentally but necessarily, systematic from its very nature. It belongs to the very essence of slavery to divest its victims of humanity. Slavery, he is going to quote somebody else, slavery, says Professor Hoole, so William Hoole was a British philosopher and historian of science and ethicist in the mid-19th century. So there is a fun story that I'm going to tell you about William Hoole. So he did book reviews because he was a philosopher and historian of science, and one of the science journals wanted him to do a review of a book, and it was written by someone who we nowadays would call a scientist, except that word didn't exist yet. So if you reviewed a book by a scientist, you were reviewing a book by someone called a man of science. Except for this book was written by a woman, so he couldn't say man of science, so he created the word scientist. The word scientist was actually a 19th century political correctness and gender inclusivity. So the next time somebody says that women are not necessarily very good scientists, please point out that a woman was literally the first scientist. But anyway, the reference that he's going to give here is to chapter 24 of the first volume of Hoole's Elements of Morality. Hoole contends that slavery tries to turn a person into a thing, into a separable part of the master's body. And that has been a traditional theory of slavery for the entirety of Western civilization. Aristotle was one of the first theoreticians of slavery that we know about now, and he thought that the enslaved person was literally a part of the master. Right? So it's as if I could send my hand off to do something without me being around. That was the relationship between slave and master, according to Aristotle. Now, Aristotle thought that that was true because of deep genetic incapacities that enslaved people had. They were simply incapable of running their own lives, and so it was best for them to be a valued part of a master's body. But that has definitely been the theory of slavery for the entire duration of Western civilization. And Thornwell here is about to say that no one would ever think such a thing, and it's completely ludicrous, but that is the standard theory. All right. Slavery, says Professor Houle, is contrary to the fundamental principle of morality. It neglects the great primary distinction of persons and things, converting a person into a thing, an object merely passive, without any recognized attributes of human nature. A slave is, in the eye of the state which stamps him with that character, not acknowledged as a man. His pleasures and pains, his wishes and desires, his needs and springs of action, his thoughts and feelings are of no value whatever in the eye of the community. He is reduced to the level of the brutes, where brute means animal. If this be a just description of slavery, the wonder is not that the civilized world is now indignant at its outrages and wrongs, but that it has been so slow in detecting its enormities. That mankind for so many centuries acquiesced in a system which contradicted every impulse of nature, every whisper of conscience, every dictate of religion, a system as monstrously unnatural as a general effort to walk upon the head or to think with the feet. I have, however, no hesitation in saying that whatever may be the technical language of the law, in relation to certain aspects in which slavery is contemplated, the ideas of personal rights and personal responsibility pervade the whole system. It is a relation of man to man, a form of civil society, so he's explicitly rejecting Aristotle's theory there, for which persons are the only elements, and not a relation of man to things. Under the Roman code, in which more offensive language than that employed by ourselves was used in reference to the subject, the apostles did not regard the personality of the slave as lost or swallowed up in the propriety of the master. They treat him as a man, possessed of certain rights. Which rights? Which rights were enslaved people in the antebellum South treated as having? People held as slaves were forbidden from acquiring literacy and from meeting in groups of more than 2 or 3 without a white person present. They were forbidden from changing their residence. They were forbidden from or commanded to sex acts with various people. They were forbidden from raising their own children in many cases while being required to raise someone else's. They might be permitted to marry, but they might be sold separately from one another. The pursuit of a meaningful family life was regularly thwarted. Their speech was tightly restricted. They could not use the press or assembly. They were obliged to perform the rites of a religion to which they might not have felt called and forbidden from practicing other religions. Some slaves did bear arms, but only at the sufferance of their masters. Obviously, the rights to vote, serve on juries, be judged by a jury of their peers, and run for elective office were not respected. So what precisely exactly is left? All right. But they've got rights, just none of the ones that you've ever heard about. They treat him as a man possessed of certain rights, which it was injustice to disregard, and make it the office of Christianity to protect these rights by the solemn sanctions of religion, to enforce upon masters the necessity, the moral obligation of rendering to their bondmen that which is just and equal. Paul treats the services of slaves as duties, not like the toil of the ox or the ass, a labor extracted by the stringency of discipline, but a moral debt, in the payment of which they were rendering an homage to God. Servants, says he, be obedient to them that are your masters, according to the flesh, with fear and trembling and singleness of your heart, as unto Christ, not with eye service as men-pleasers, but as the servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will doing service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good thing any man doeth, the same shall he receive of the Lord, whether he be bond or free. A person might consider that sort of remark damns the text rather than makes holy or sacred that which it justifies. I need not say to those who are acquainted with the very elements of moral philosophy that obedience, except as a figured term, can never be applied to any but rational, intelligent, responsible agents. It is a voluntary homage to law, implies moral obligation and a sense of duty, and can only in the way of analogy be affirmed of the instinctive submission of brutes or the mechanical employment of instruments and things. So, see, the Bible tells people to obey their masters, but you would never tell a machine to obey the engineer. You would never meaningfully think that you could tell a cow to do something. It doesn't understand you. So see, since the Bible specifically tells enslaved people to obey their masters, it is treating them as if they were people subject to instruction. So see, instructing them is a form of respect. The apostle not merely recognizes the moral agency of slaves and the phraseology which he uses them, but treats them as possessed of conscience, reason, and will by the motives which he presses. He says to them, in effect, that their services to their masters are duties which they owe to God, that a moral character attaches to their works, and that they are the subjects of praise or blame according to the principles upon which their obedience is rendered. The state of things so graphically described and eloquently explored by the great father of Unitarian Christianity in America is a palpable impossibility. So that's Channing, whom he mentioned earlier. The constitution of the human mind is in flagrant contradiction to the absorption of the conscience, will, and understanding of one man into the personality of another. It is a truth which cannot be conceived, and if it ever could take place, the termination of all responsibility on the part of the slave would render it ridiculous to labor for his spiritual improvement. And if it ever could take place, the termination of all responsibility on the part of the slave would render it ridiculous to labor for his spiritual improvement, or attribute to him any other immortality than that which Indian fables ascribe to the dog as the faithful companion of his master. And yet upon this absurdity, that slavery divests its victims of humanity, that it degrades them from the rank of responsible and voluntary agents to the condition of tools or brutes, the whole philosophical argument against the morality of the system as an existing institution is founded. We grant most cheerfully, and we make an admission in no way inconsistent with Southern slavery or the slavery sanctioned in the Bible, that though, quote, the human soul may be lost, it cannot either be sold or made a gift of to another, that conscience may be bound or may be slaughtered, but cannot be transferred to another's keeping, that moral responsibility, instead of being shifted entirely from one to another, or instead of being shared between two, each taking half or a portion, is doubled whenever it is attempted to be transferred or to be deposited or to be pawned. The property of man in man, a fiction to which even the imagination cannot give consistency, is the miserable cant of those who would storm by prejudice what they cannot demolish by argument. We do not even pretend that the organs of the body can be said strictly to belong to one another. The limbs and members of my servant are not mine, but his. They are not tools and instruments, which I can sport with pleasure, but the sacred possession of a human being, which cannot be invaded without the authority of law, and for the use of which he can never be divested of his responsibility to God. If we were to trust people's obedience to God to guide their moral character, then we wouldn't have laws. If then slavery is not inconsistent with the existence of personal rights and of moral obligation, it may be asked, in what does its peculiarity consist? What is it that makes a man a slave? We answer, the obligation to labor for another, determined by the providence of God, independently of the provisions of a contract. The right which the master has is a right not to the man, but to his labor. The duty which the slave owes is the service which, in conformity with this right, the master exacts. The essential difference betwixt free and slave labor is that one is rendered in consequence of a contract, the other is rendered in the consequence of a command. The laborers in each case are morally equal, equally responsible, equally men, but they work upon different principles. So the claim is that slavery doesn't involve ownership of human beings, but only of their labor. The enslaved person owes labor to her slaveholder. But why? Someone has a right to my labor because I signed an employment contract while I'm not under duress. No enslaved person ever did that, so what accounts for the ownership? Thornwell is indirectly appealing back to his relativism and his solution to the problem of evil. The view is that we know that God meant for enslaved people to be enslaved because, as you can see, they are enslaved. You can't question the customs of your society because that would be insane. You can't question the goodness of anything that actually happens because that would be atheistic or satanic. That's the underlying structure of the argument. The providence of God marks out for the slave the precise services in the lawful commands of the master, which it is the divine will that he should render. The painful necessities of his case are often as stringent among the free laborer, and determine with as stern a mandate what contracts he shall make. Neither can he be said to select his employments. All right, so this is an appeal to the Protestant work ethic, saying, the slave has been sent into the world about his tasks, but that's not actually different from anybody else being sent to the world about their tasks. And look, he says, if you're a free laborer, but in a period of high unemployment, and so you don't meaningfully have choices about which jobs to take, that's just as bad as the slave. He's so close to realizing that actually not every employment contract is a legitimate one, and that unions and things like that might play a legitimate role in the world. He's so close. But he's saying that since there cannot possibly be a problem with other abuses of power, that this abuse of power is not problematic. And what most of us will do is just want to say, well, I see the comparison. It's just that now you've made me wonder about wage labor in the North, and maybe that was a problem. Whatever control the master has over the person of the slave is subsidiary to this right to his labor. What he sells is not the man, but the property in his services. True, he chastises the man, but the punishments inflicted for disobedience are no more inconsistent with personal responsibilities than the punishments inflicted by the law for breaches of contract. On the contrary, punishment in contradistinction from suffering always implies responsibility, and a right which cannot be enforced is a right which society, as an organized community, has not yet acknowledged. The chastisement of slaves are accordingly no more entitled to awaken the indignities of loyal and faithful citizens, however pretended philanthropists may describe the horrors of the scourge and the lash, than the penalties of disgrace, imprisonment, or death, which all nations have inflicted upon crimes against the state. And that is necessary in any case. All that is necessary in any case is that the punishment should be just. It is not part of the essence of slavery, however, that the rights of the slave should be left to the caprice or the interest of the master, and in the southern states provisions are actually made, whether adequate or inadequate, it is useless here to discuss, to protect him from want, cruelty, and unlawful domination. Provisions are made which recognize the doctrine of the apostle, that he is a subject of rights and that justice must be rendered to his claims. So the idea here is, sure, we whip the people we enslave, but it's only because we own their labor. I don't think that I own the person. I just think that whipping him is the only way to get to his labor, which I have the right to. And I'm not selling a person. I'm just selling a claim to a person's labor. And all of the other things that I make my slaves do, that's just ways of getting at their labor. Of course, if everything that somebody does for you is something that you call their labor, then you can have them do anything that you want. There's no difference between a person and their labor if everything that they can do for you is defined as labor, and a person is just what she does. The idea that whipping someone pays them the compliment of confirming that they can learn from experience and are responsible for their actions. This is literally the plot of a short story by Kafka in which your crimes are written on your flesh until it kills you, and this is called punishment rather than torture. People defending systems of oppression are perpetually insisting that the systems aren't oppressive because the oppressors are very nice people with obligations to treat their victims well. They might have obligations, but that doesn't necessarily matter to them. This view of the subject exposes the confusion, which obtains in most popular treatises of morals, of slavery with involuntary servitude. The service, insofar as it consists in the motions of the limbs or organs of the body, must be voluntary, or it could not exist at all. If by voluntary be meant, however, that which results from hearty consent and is accordingly rendered with cheerfulness, it is precisely the service which the law of God enjoins. So Thornwell is confusing voluntary with intentional. The enslaved person intended to pick cotton. That does not imply that she was doing it voluntarily. If someone points a gun at me and demands my wallet, I will intentionally give it to him, but I can assure you that it will not be voluntary. Servants are exhorted to obey from considerations of duty, to make conscience of their tasks, with goodwill doing service as to the Lord and not to men. Whether, in point of fact, their service in this sense shall be voluntary will depend on their moral character, but the same may be said of free labor. There are other motives beside the lash that may drive men to toil when they are far from toiling with cheerfulness or goodwill. Right? So you have a right to their labor, and if they want to do the labor, then that's voluntary, and if they don't want to do the labor, then you're using the whipping to get them to do that which they are obligated to do anyway, but they're really obligated to do it cheerfully so that you don't have to whip them. There is a moral bondage. The most galling and degrading species of servitude in which he may be held is with the chains of brass, who scorns to call any other master on, who scorns to call any man master on earth. Those who have most patiently studied the ends of government and the theory of political society, who are best prepared to solve the problems connected with the nature and extent of the individual restraints which the security of public order demands, those who have most profoundly investigated the whole question of civil and political liberty may yet be slaves. They may submit to the sway of a fiercer and more cruel tyrant than any despot who ever wielded a scepter on earth. Quote, Jesus answered them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, whosoever committeth sin is the servant or slave of sin. There is a freedom which is the end and glory of man, the only freedom which is the pen of inspiration has commended, and which, from its very nature, is independent of the degrees of kings or the mandates of states. It is the freedom which God approves, which Jesus bought with his blood, and the Holy Spirit effectually seals by his grace, the liberty wherewith Christ has made us free. It consists essentially in the dominion of rectitude, in the emancipation of the will from the power of sin, the release of the affections from the attractions of earth, the exemption of the understanding from the deceits of prejudice and error. It is a freedom which the truth of God brings with it, a freedom enjoyed by the martyr at the stake, a slave in his chains, a prisoner in his dungeon, as well as the king upon his throne. Independent of time or place or the accidents of fortune, it is the breath of the soul as regenerated and redeemed, and can no more be torn from us than the atmosphere of heaven can be restrained. If the Son shall make you free, you shall be free indeed. This freedom makes man truly a man, and it is precisely the assertion of this freedom, this dominion of rectitude, this supremacy of right, which the apostle enjoins upon slaves, when he exhorts them to obey their masters in singleness of heart as unto Christ, to despise eye service, that is, just looking like you're doing your job, but to do their work as in the eye of God. To obey under the influence of these motives is to be slaves no longer. This is a free service, a service which God accepts as the loyal homage of the soul, and which proclaims them to be the Lord's freed men while they honor their masters on earth. Such slavery might be their glory, might fit them for thrones in the kingdom of God. So far was the apostle, therefore, from regarding involuntary servitude as the characteristic of slavery that he condemned such servitude as a sin. He treats it as something that is abject, mean, despicable, but insists, on the other hand, that slavery dignifies and ennobles the servant who obeys from the heart. So here, Thornwell is confusing political freedom with freedom of the will. Nobody ever pretended that an enslaved person couldn't fix her heart on Christ or whatever. But that's not what political freedom is about. Political freedom is about freedom of movement and external decision. What Thornwell has described is something that in contemporary culture is called the sunken place. The sunken place is an idea that Jordan Peele came up with for his 2017 racial horror movie, Get Out. The following will be a complete set of spoilers for the film, but if you haven't seen it, like Get With the Program, it's a major cultural touchstone at this point. Anyway. In the film, seemingly condescending and creepy, but kind of maybe benevolent-ish, white people turn out to be monsters who kidnap black people to put their own brains into. That gives white people superior bodies, and is supposed to benefit its black victims too, since the black victim gets a superior mind. The black victim's consciousness remains, only able to observe what his body sees and hears. His consciousness and his sense of his own body is sunken into an endless starry abyss, which I couldn't find any good pictures of, with nothing to push against, just falling forever. In that abyss, no doubt, the lobotomized victim can turn to Jesus if he likes. That's what Thornwell thinks that freedom for black people is supposed to be. He continues. But while it may be admitted that slavery is not absolutely inconsistent with moral responsibility, nor the freedom of a moral agent, it may be asked whether the slave is not stripped of some of the rights which belong to him essentially as a man, and in this view, whether the relation is not incompatible with the spirit of the gospel, which asserts and promotes the dignity and perfection of our race. In this case, race being the human race. In other words, whether there is not a limitation upon the moral freedom of the slave, whether his situation does not preclude him from discharging his whole duty as a man, and therefore whether the relation is not ultimately destructive of the full complement of human rights. So the concern is, okay, maybe slavery allows the slave, the enslaved person, complete freedom when it comes to joyfully working, but is there anything else that freedom would consist in? That the full human life would consist in? This question, it seems to me, comprises the whole moral difficulty of slavery, and it is at this point of the discussion that the friends and enemies of the system are equally tempted to run into extravagance and excess, the one party denying the inestimable value of freedom, the other exaggerating the nature and extent of human rights, and both overlooking the real scope and purpose of the gospel in its relation to the present interests of man. That the design of Christianity is to secure the perfection of the race is obvious from all its arrangements, and that when this end shall have been consummated, slavery must cease to exist is equally clear. This is only asserting that there will be no bondage in heaven. Among beings of the same nature, each relatively perfect, there can be no other inequalities than those which spring from superior endowments. The outward advantages of all must be of the same kind, though they may vary in degrees proportioned to the capacity of the individuals to enjoy them. If Adam had never sinned and brought death into the world with all our woe, the bondage of man to man would never have been instituted, and when the effects of transgression shall have been purged from the earth, and the new heavens and the new earth wherein dwelleth righteousness given to the saints, all bondage shall be abolished. In this sense, slavery is inconsistent with the spirit of the gospel, that it contemplates a state of things, an existing economy, which it is the design of the gospel to remove. Slavery is a part of the curse which sin has introduced into the world, and stands in the same general relations to Christianity as poverty, sickness, disease, or death. In other words, it is a relation which can only be conceived as taking place among fallen beings, tainted with a curse. It springs not from the nature of man as man, nor from the nature of society as such, but from the nature of man as sinful, and the nature of society as disordered. It is amazing that his sin-darkened intellect is able to deduce who is to be held in bondage to whom. But again, the appeal is to custom and to the goodness of the world. These people are held in bondage, therefore they should be. The idea of God is just a big stop thrown at any efforts to think about the issue. Slavery is joined with poverty, sickness, disease, and death. Presumably all of these will be done away with come the judgment day. However, as I suspect Thornwell knows, we do actually try to prevent poverty, sickness, disease, and where possible death. We don't wait until Gabriel blows his horn to go to the doctor or get a job. Why is slavery, alone of all evils, never to be ameliorated until the apocalypse? I want to point out a remark by Robert E. Lee in this context. He wrote from Fort Brown in Texas on December 27, 1856, about 4 years before the secession started. This was something that matched Thornwell's approach. This is often misquoted. If you take just the right words out of it, it sounds like Lee wasn't super fond of slavery, but if you put all the words in, then it turns out that he kind of is. So we've seen that Thornwell wants to say, there won't be slavery in heaven. So eventually slavery will wash away, because eventually all of the bad qualities of sinful humanity will be washed away. And so disease and slavery and death will all go away in heaven, right? Come the judgment day. That's kind of what Lee had to say. Lee wrote regarding slavery, he wrote this to his wife. In this enlightened age, there are few, I believe, but what will acknowledge that slavery as an institution is a moral and political evil in any country. It is useless to expatiate on its disadvantages. I think it, however, a greater evil to the white than to the black race, and while my feelings are strongly interested in behalf of the latter, my sympathies are more strong for the former. The blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa, morally, socially, and physically. The painful discipline they are undergoing is necessary for their instruction as a race, and I hope will prepare and lead them to better things. How long their subjection may be necessary is known and ordered by a wise and merciful providence. Their emancipation will sooner result from the mild and melting influence of Christianity than the storms and tempests of fiery controversy. This influence, though slow, is sure. The doctrines and miracles of our Savior have required nearly 2,000 years to convert but a small part of the human race, and even Christian nations, what gross errors still exist. While we see the course of the final abolition of human slavery is onward, and we must give it the aid of our prayers and all justifiable means in our power, we must leave the progress as well as the result in his hands who sees the end, who chooses to work by slow influences, and with whom 2,000 years are but a single day. Although the abolitionist must know this and must see that he has neither the right or power of operating except by moral means and suasion, and if he means well to the slave, he must not create angry feelings in the master, that although he may not approve the mode by which it pleases Providence to accomplish its purposes, the result will nevertheless be the same, that the reasons he gives for interference in what he has no concern holds good for every kind of interference with our neighbors when we disapprove their conduct. Still, I feel he will persevere in his evil course. Is it not strange that the descendants of those pilgrim fathers who crossed the Atlantic to preserve their own freedom of opinion have always proved themselves intolerant of the spiritual liberty of others? This was an early version of making fun of the tolerant left. So what Lee is saying here is slavery is divinely inspired. Presumably God will be getting rid of it. God took 2,000 years to Christianize Western Europe. 2,000 years is like a day to him. God's got a lot of days, so it might take 100,000 years for us to finally beat the black out of everybody. But, that's how God seems to want the thing. And, so, it's all up to God. There's Confederate Christianity for you. It is an excuse for not exercising moral restraint. It is an excuse for not trying to control yourself. It's an excuse for a lack of moral self-discipline in the pursuit of good character. Let me keep going. There's several pages left, and there's going to be less kind of commentary interspersed in between. But let's continue. Upon an earth radiant with the smile of heaven, or in the paradise of God, we can no more picture the figure of a slave than we can picture the figures of the halt, the maimed, the lame, and the blind. We can no more fancy the existence of masters and tasks than we can dream of hospitals and beggars. These are the badges of a fallen world. That it is inconsistent with a perfect state, that it is not absolutely good, a blessing, the most strenuous defender of slavery ought not to permit himself to deny, and the devout believer in Revelation would be made to close his eyes to the fact that the form in which it is first threatened in the Bible is as a punishment for crime. When we consider the diversities in moral position which sin has been the means of entailing upon the race, we may be justified in affirming that relatively to some persons and to some times, slavery may be a good, or to speak more accurately, a condition, though founded on a curse, from which the providence of God extracts a blessing. We are not to judge of the institution of the present by the standard of the future life. That is, from the fact that slavery will not exist in a morally perfect realm, we shouldn't try not to have it around here. We should go ahead and try to have moral badness around here. We are not to judge of the institutions of the present by the standard of the future life. We're not to confound the absolute and the relative. For aught that we know, slavery may stand in somewhat the same relation to political society in a world like ours, in which mortality stands to the human body, and it may be as vain to think of extirpating it as to think of giving man immortality upon earth. It may be, and perhaps is in some of its forms, essential to an imperfect society, and it may be, and perhaps is, the purpose of God that it should be found among men as long as the slime of the serpent is over the earth. Admit, then, that slavery is inconsistent with the spirit of the gospel, as that spirit is to find its full development in a state of glory, yet the conclusion by no means follows that it is inconsistent with the spirit of the gospel, as that spirit operates among rebels and sinners in a degraded world and under a dispensation of grace. The real question is whether it is incompatible with the spiritual prosperity of individuals or the general progress and education of society. It is clearly the office of the gospel to train men, by virtue of the discipline of temptation, hardship, and evil, for a state of perfection and glory. Nothing is inconsistent with it which does not present obstacles to the practice of duty, which its own grace is inadequate to surmount. Whoever, therefore, would maintain that slavery is incompatible with the present relations of the gospel to man must maintain that it precludes him, by its very nature, from the discharge of some of the duties which the gospel enjoins. It is nothing to the purpose to speak of it generally and vaguely as an evil. It must be shown to be an evil of that specific kind which necessitates the commission of sin and the neglect of duty. Neither is it sufficient to say that it presents strong temptations to sin in the violent motives which a master may press upon a slave to execute unlawful commands. This can be affirmed of numberless other situations in which none will contend that it is unlawful to be found. The question is not whether it is the state most favorable to the offices of piety and virtue, but whether it is essentially incompatible with their exercise. This is the true issue. So the way to evaluate slavery is to see whether it requires that somebody violate some kind of Christian moral edict. The fundamental mistake of those who affirm slavery to be essentially sinful is that the duties of all men are specifically the same. The argument, fully and legitimately carried out, would condemn every arrangement of society which did not secure to all its members an absolute equality of position. It is the very spirit of socialism and communism. Now, there's two things going on there. One is this is part of his sort of twisted version of the Protestant work ethic that says, look, people can be in any of many positions. We can't really evaluate. I mean, I'm sure that they're doing their part in God's plan. The other part is, again, he's rejecting the Declaration of Independence pretty explicitly because the Declaration of Independence does say that all men are created equal. It doesn't mean that we're equal in every way. It doesn't mean that we're the same, right? It means that there are certain fundamental facts about freedom of choice and self-determination that are equal to everybody, that know that there's not very many people who are fundamentally more capable than you of running your life, and there's very few people who are fundamentally less capable than you of running their lives. Right? That's what the Declaration of Independence says, and he says, no, that's wrong. We are not created equal in really any sense at all. And, interestingly, he identifies the Declaration of Independence with socialism and communism. The doctrine of the Bible, on the other hand, is that the specific duties, the things actually required to be done, are as various as the circumstances in which men are placed. The circumstances in which men are placed in this sublunary plane. So, once upon a time, people thought that the Earth was at the center of the universe, and the planets, moons, the sun all went around the Earth in various ways, and the moon, Luna, was the closest one, and they thought that the moon and everything above it or more distant from it was somehow supernatural, better, heavenly, but everything below the moon was fallen, wretched. So when someone says sublunary, they mean in our, non-divine part of the universe. The doctrine of the Bible, on the other hand, is that the specific duties, the things actually required to be done, are as various as the circumstances in which men are placed. The circumstances in which men are placed in this sublunary state are exceedingly diversified, but there is probably no external condition in which the actual discipline to which men are subjected may not terminate in the temper of universal holiness. Some are tried in one way, some in another, some are required to do one set of things, some another. But the spirit of true obedience is universally the same, and the result of an effectual probation is, in every case, a moral sympathy with the moral perfections of God. The lesson is the same, however different the textbooks from which it might have been taught. So this is, again, his application of Protestant work ethic. If you think that God sent people into the world to perform diverse tasks, then you might think that God sent people into the world to pick cotton. However, it is a theological novelty to say that God sent people into the world to pick cotton, but didn't tell them about it, but instead told somebody else who by pure chance happens to be able to profit from their fulfillment of their divinely appointed mission. It's a stunning coincidence. Now, unless slavery is incompatible with the habitudes of holiness, unless it is inconsistent with the spirit of philanthropy or the spirit of piety, unless it furnishes no opportunities for obedience of the law, it is not inconsistent with the pursuit or attainment of the highest excellence. The highest excellence is your attitude in the sunken place. It is no abridgment of moral freedom. The slave may come from the probation of his circumstances as fully stamped with the image of God as those who have enjoyed an easier lot. He may be as completely in unison with the spirit of universal rectitude as if he had been trained on flowery beds of ease. Let him discharge his whole duty in the actual circumstances of his case, and he is entitled to the praise of a perfect and an upright man. The question with God is not what he has done, but how. Man looketh at the outward circumstances, but God looketh at the heart. The slave is to show his reverence for God, the freedom of his inward man, by a cheerful obedience to the lawful commands of his master. The master, his regard for one who is his master in heaven, by regarding to the slave that which is just and equal. Right? So, on the one hand, the slave is supposed to cheerfully obey the master, and on the other hand, the master needs to bear in mind that he too is has a master in heaven, so he might want to moderate his behavior accordingly. But it seems like pretty much everything here has been justified as some way of getting at the enslaved person's labor, right? I mean, if I can torture somebody all the way unto death, maybe, in order to try to get their labor out of them, and I can do that legitimately as their master, well, then there's not many things that I cannot do that are legitimate as a master and that are hence not just or equal. All right. The character of both is determined in the sight of God by the spirit which pervades their single acts, however the acts may differ in themselves. If slavery is not essentially incompatible with the discharge of the essential duties as a spiritual service, it is not destructive of the essential rights of humanity. All political organizations, our enemies themselves being judges, are subservient to the interest of the individual. All this, the grace of God, through the instrumentality of the gospel, may accomplish in the person of one who is bound to labor under the direction and authority of another. The servant of men may be the freeman of the Lord, if his situation is compatible, as it confessedly is, with the achievement of the great end of his existence. If in the school of bondage he may be trained for the glorification and enjoyment of God, he is not divested of any of the rights which belong to him essentially as man. So the rights that belong to you essentially as man consist exclusively in your power to turn your heart to God in the sunken place. And I am deeply curious whether Thornwell would have minded being put into a dungeon and told that he was still free. He may develop his moral and religious nature, the source and measure of all his rights, and must consequently retain every characteristic of essential humanity. There are rights which belong to men in other situations, to which he is by no means entitled. The rights of the citizen, for example, and the free member of the Commonwealth. They are not his for the simple reason that they are not essential, but contingent. They do not spring from humanity simply considered, for then they would belong to women and children, but from humanity in such and such relations. So close. As to the influence of slavery upon the advancement of society, there can be no doubt, if the government of God be moral, that the true progress of communities and states, as well as the highest interests of individuals, depend upon the fidelity with which the duties are discharged in every condition of life. It is the great law of providential education that to every one that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance, but from him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath. In this way the reign of universal justice is promoted, and wherever that obtains, the development of the individual, which is the great end of all social and political institutions, must infallibly take place. The prosperity of the state at the same time is secured, and secured too without the necessity of sudden changes or violent revolutions. Besides the arguments drawn from considerations of justice and the essential rights of humanity, the incompatibility of slavery with the spirit and temper of the gospel is not unfrequently attempted to be made out from the injunction of the Savior to love our neighbor as ourselves and to do unto others as we would have them do unto us. The principle, however, upon which the precept of universal benevolence is interpreted in this case, makes it the sanction of the grossest wickedness. If we are to regulate our conduct to others by the arbitrary expectations which, in their circumstances, our passions and selfishness might prompt us to indulge, there ceases to be any other standard of morality than caprice. The humor of every man becomes law. The judge could not condemn the criminal, nor the executioner behead him. The rich man could not claim his possessions, nor the poor learn patience from their sufferings. If I am bound to emancipate my slave, because if the tables were turned and our situations reversed, I should covet this boon from him, I should be found upon the same principle to promote my indigent neighbors around me to an absolute equality with myself. So the argument that he's considering is from the Golden Rule. The Golden Rule says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And the way to test whether your action is in accordance with the Golden Rule is to ask, if we were actually in reverse situations, would I mind you doing to me what I'm thinking about doing to you? Right? So we can see, is slavery compatible with the Golden Rule? Well, slavery consists in the master telling the enslaved person what to do and enforcing obedience. And then we say, well, wait a minute, what if the situation were reversed and you were the enslaved person? Would you want to be free? Yes. Actually, I really object to the whole being told what to do and being beaten into doing it. So the Golden Rule would tell you, well, then you need to liberate your slave because you would not be willing to be one. And his response is, look, I'm not going to do to people what I would want other people to do to me if I were in a different situation. Why, gosh, if I did that, I couldn't be rich anymore. That's literally the argument that he makes. If I am bound to emancipate my slave because if the tables returned and our situations reversed, I should covet this boon from him. I should be found upon the same principle to promote my indigent neighbors around me to an absolute equality with myself. He has identified abolitionism with strict equality of all kinds. And that's not particularly true. The difference between rich and poor is something that you might be able to defend on some grounds, and if you can't, you should do away with it. That neither the Jews, in whose law the precept was first formally announced, nor the apostles, to whom it was more fully expounded by the Savior, ever applied it in the sense of the abolitionists, is a strong presumption against their mode of interpretation. The truth is, it is nothing but the inculcation of justice from motives of love. Our Savior directs us to do unto others what in their situations it would be right and reasonable in us to expect from them. We are to put ourselves in their situations that we may duly weigh the circumstances of their case and so be prepared to apply to it the principles of universal justice. So instead of doing unto others what you would have them do unto others what you, according to you, should want if you were in their circumstances. So go ahead and decide for somebody else what it's best for you to do for them, and then do that. The instances which are usually urged to prove that slavery is inconsistent with the rights of man, unfortunately for the argument, are not peculiar to slavery. There are incidents to poverty, whenever it prevails in a distressing form, and a wise system of legislation could much more easily detach them from the system of slavery than from the deep obedience which is sure to crush the laborer or a crowded population obtains. They are at best only abuses in the one case which might be corrected, while in the other they seem to be inseparable elements. And you might think that a system of wage labor is actually an awful lot easier to fix than a system of slave labor, but if the two are equally hard to fix, then the two are equally problematic. Enough has been said to show that slavery is not repugnant to the spirit of the gospel in its present relations to our race. It is one of the conditions in which God is conducting the moral probation of man, a condition not incompatible with the highest moral freedom, the true glory of the race, and therefore not unfit for the moral and spiritual discipline which Christianity has instituted. It is one of the schools in which immortal spirits are trained for their final destiny. If it is attended with severer hardships, these hardships are compensated by fewer duties, and the very violence of its temptations gives dignity and luster to its virtues. That is to say, it's terrible that the master rapes you continually, but you're becoming a better person. You're growing as a person every time you're brutalized. The slave may be fitted in his humble and, if you please, degraded lot for shining as a star in the firmament of heaven. In his narrow sphere he may be cherishing and cultivating a spirit which shall render him meet for the society of angels and the everlasting enjoyment of God. The Christian beholds in him not a tool, not a chattel, not a brute or thing, but an immortal spirit assigned to a particular position in this world of wretchedness and sin, in which he is required to work out the destiny which attaches to him in common with his fellows as a man. The important question among us is that which relates to the discharge of our own duties as masters. What are the things which are just and equal that we are required to render to our slaves? But before attending to this inquiry, it may be well to notice the popular argument against slavery drawn from the fact that as it must have begun in the perpetration of grievous wrong, no lapse of time can make it subsequently right. So the idea here is slavery definitely started out morally wrong because no one was born into slavery, so it can't have turned right in the interim between the initial kidnappings and the present. Prescription can never sanctify injustice. The answer turns upon the distinction between the wrong itself and the effects of the wrong. The criminal act, whatever it may have been, by which a man was reduced to the condition of bondage, can never cease to be otherwise than criminal, but the relations to which that act gave rise may themselves be consistent with the will of God and the foundation of new and important duties. The relations of a man to his natural offspring, though wickedly formed, give rise to duties which would be ill discharged by the destruction of the child. That is an odd example, and I think that what he has in mind there is that if a fetus is conceived as a result of sexual assault, that you still wouldn't have an abortion, which is, I'm not sure necessarily true in many cases. It is a weird example. But the broader point that he's trying to make is slavery came into the world, he said, through sin. And initially it was the sin of Adam, but it's through the theory, more recently, it's through the theory that if you captured someone in a war, they became your property to destroy if you wish and to command if you prefer. Slave raids in West Africa consisted in creating a fight, pretending that you were standing your ground, capturing the alleged assailants, claiming that in their alleged assault on you they forwent their rights, and thus you owned them to kill or order about as you like. Thornwell acknowledges that that theory is false, and in this case he is ahead of his time. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, allowed for involuntary servitude as a punishment for those found guilty of a crime. And so the slave raids in West Africa began again, except domestically. The slave raiders were the police, and the convict leasing and labor system repeated the entire early history of slavery. Even Thornwell might not have approved, though one expects that he could have come up with a rationalization. No doubt the principle upon which slavery has been most largely engrafted into society as an integral element of its complex constitution, the principle that captivity in war gives a right to the life of a prisoner for which his bondage is accepted in exchange, is not consistent with the truth of the case. But it was recognized as true for ages and generations. It was a step in the modern development of nations and has laid the foundation of institutions and usages which cannot now be disturbed with impunity, and in regard to which our conduct must be regulated by the fact of their existence and not by speculation upon the morality of their origin. Our world exhibits everywhere the traces of sin, and if we tolerate nothing but that we may expect to find in a state of perfection and holiness, we must leave this scene of sublunary distraction, as we'd have to rise to heaven. The education of states is a slow process. Their standards of rectitude slowly approximate the standard of God, and in their ages of infancy, ignorance, and blindness, they establish many institutions upon false maxims which cannot subsequently be extirpated without abandoning the whole of the real progress they have made and reconstituting society afresh. And this is the relativism again. Granted, a thing happened in the past that we wouldn't put up with now, but it happened in the past. So it's become part of the network of customs within which we live and that we cannot coherently criticize. In treating slavery as an existing institution, a fact involving most important moral relations, one of the prime duties of the state is to protect by temporal legislation the real rights of the slave. The moral sense of the country acknowledges them, the religion of the country to a large extent ensures their observance, but until they are defined by law and enforced by penalties, there is no adequate protection of them. They are in the category of imperfect and not of perfect rights. The effect of legal protection would be to counteract whatever tendency slavery may be supposed to possess to produce servility and abjectness of mind. It would inspire a sense of personal responsibility, a certain degree of manliness and dignity of character, which would be at once a security to the master and an immense blessing to the slave. The meanness, cunning, hypocrisy, lying, and theft which accompany a sense of degradation would give place to the opposite virtues, and there would be no foundation in our social relations for that slavery which Cicero defines, obedientia fracti animi et abjecte et arbitrio carentis suo. Google Translate tells me that that means obedience of a broken and rejected and his own volition. Unfortunately, Google will not tell me what that means. But I think that the idea is obedience of someone who's just completely abject, completely helpless, completely at someone else's whim, who really cannot exercise any kind of meaningful decision making on his own. In the different systems of slavery, taken collectively, all the essential rights of humanity have been recognized by law, showing that there is nothing in the relation itself inconsistent with this legal protection. The right to acquire knowledge, which is practically admitted by us, though legally denied. So he's saying enslaved people can learn, it's just illegal. Right? We'll tolerate it by not actually calling the police unless they learn too much. Practically admitted by us, though legally denied, was fully recognized by the Romans, whose slaves were often the teachers of their children and the scholars of the Commonwealth. The right of the family was formally protected among the Spaniards, but not in the antebellum South. And the right to personal safety is largely protected by ourselves. It isn't. It was technically illegal in some contexts to murder your slaves. But if you wanted to use your female slaves as the means of production of more slaves, that was within your rights. And you could torture them pretty much as you felt like it. And even if you did break some kind of law, the slave cannot accuse you in court. The slave cannot speak in court. The slave cannot serve as a witness in court. The jury will consist exclusively of free white men. Now that is not a legal protection that any reasonable person would be satisfied by. But without stopping to inquire into which way temporal legislation may most effectually protect the rights of the slave, we hesitate not to affirm that one of the highest and most solemn obligations which rests upon the masters of the South is to give their servants, to the utmost extent of their ability, free access to the instructions and institution of the gospel. The injustice of denying them food and raiment and shelter against which the law effectually guards is nothing to the injustice of defrauding them of that bread which cometh down from heaven. Their labor is ours. From infancy to age they attend on us, they greet our introduction into the world with smiles of joy, and lament our departure with a heartfelt sorrow. And every motive of humanity and religion exacts from us that we should remunerate their services by putting within their reach the means of securing a blessed immortality. The meanest slave has in him a soul of priceless value. No earthly or celestial language can exaggerate its worth. That soul has sinned. It is under the curse of the Almighty, and nothing can save it from an intolerable hell but the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. They must hear this joyful sound or perish. For how shall they believe in him of whom they have not heard? And how shall they hear without a preacher? And how shall they preach except they be sent? Our design in giving them the gospel is not to civilize them, not to change their social condition, not to exalt them into citizens or freemen. It is to save them. In the sunken place, they will turn to God. The church contemplates them only as sinners, and she is straitened to declare unto them the unsearchable riches of Christ. Christian knowledge inculcates contentment with our lot, and in bringing before us the tremendous realities of eternity renders us comparatively indifferent to the inconveniences and hardships of time. It subdues those passions and prejudices from which all real danger to the social economy springs. Some have objected, says a splendid writer, Robert Hall, to the instruction of the lower classes from an apprehension that it would lift them above their sphere, make them dissatisfied with their station in life, and by impairing the habits of subordination, endanger the tranquility of the state, an objection devoid surely of all force and validity. It is not easy to conceive in what manner instructing men in their duties can prompt them to neglect those duties, or how that enlargement of reason which enables them to comprehend the true grounds of authority and the obligation to obedience should indispose them to obey. Of course, if people learn how to think on their own, they might realize that those sources of authority are not actually sources of legitimate authority. Our highest security in these states lies in the confidence and affection of our servants, and nothing will more effectually propitiate their regards than consistent efforts upon our part to promote their everlasting good. They will feel that those are not tyrants who are striving to bring them unto God, and they will be slow to cast off a system which has become associated in their minds with their dearest hopes and most precious consolations. Brutal ignorance is indeed to be dreaded. The only security against it is physical force. It is the parent of ferocity, of rashness, and of desperate enterprises. But Christian knowledge softens and subdues. Christ Jesus, in binding his subjects to God, binds them more closely to each other in the ties of confidence, fidelity, and love. We would say then to you and to all our brethren of the South, go on in your present undertaking, and though our common enemies may continue to revile, you will be consolidating the elements of your social fabric so firmly and compactly that it shall defy the storms of fanaticism, while the spectacle you will exhibit of union, sympathy, and confidence among the different orders of the community will be a standing refutation of all their accusations against us. Go on in this noble enterprise until every slave in our borders shall know of Jesus and the resurrection, and the blessing of God will attend you, and turn back the tide of indignation which the public opinion of the world is endeavoring to roll upon you. Go on in this career and afford another illustration of what all experience has demonstrated, that Christianity is the cheap defense of every institution which contributes to the progress of man. I hope that you've learned something. There are more sermons to come with a little less introduction and a little